Fantastic. So people are joining in. That's brilliant. We'll obviously give it the customary few minutes while people connect and that sort of thing. Well, a welcome to everyone as you start joining. Just a quick explanation. Those of you who have been to one of these lectures before are probably used to seeing my bookcase behind me, and you're now seeing some greenness behind me. And this isn't my garden. I'm actually out excavating in the field, so I'm talking to you from deepest, darkest Lincolnshire. So hopefully the technology is not going to break down while you all join in. But welcome to the Society for Church Archaeology lecture. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, just while let people connect. Usual sort of house rules of make sure your microphones and so forth are off. I'm sure you'll have some questions for our speaker, which would be brilliant. If you type those into the chat box, Rob will field the questions at the end as usual. I'm afraid I'm partly because I'm holding a phone doing this to talk to you. I'm not going to be able to stay through the whole lecture, so I won't be able to thank our speaker. But I'll thank her in advance and that sort of thing. Hopefully we've got people from all around the world, from North America. I don't know if anyone from Australia is here today, but I hope so. And the weather here in the UK, or certainly where I am, has been absolutely gorgeous. So that's why I'm probably looking a bit sunburnt. So I think I will introduce our speaker before I ramble on any further. Our speaker today is Meg Boulton, who is a teaching fellow at the University of Edinburgh and is an art historian. So we're going to have a slightly different angle today, but I think you're going to really enjoy this because it's a topic that's going to be right up our street. And today she's going to be talking about sliding doors and looking at early medieval thresholds in churches. So I think that's going to be a really exciting topic. So Meg, if you would like to take over and share your screen.
Brilliant, yeah. I will just pull this up.
Fantastic.
Hopefully that's gonna, there we go.
Excellent.
Okay. So thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to the Society for the invitation to be part of this lecture series as well. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I'm delighted to be talking about the possible significance of some of the decorative thresholds of a handful of early medieval churches, with the caveat that this is in no way going to be an exhaustive list. There are plenty of examples that could be parts of this discussion that I won't be specifically mentioning this evening. And if any of you want to mention your favourites in the questions afterwards, I'd welcome hearing your thoughts about any decorative thresholds that you would have liked to have seen here. So that said, thinking around the materiality of early medieval churches in England in the wake of the Augustinian mission in 597 often hinges on established scholarly understandings of symbolic significance and material importance. And by that, I mean the Rome stone trope that is so well rehearsed in the scholarship. However, tonight, I'm going to take those associations as read, and I'm going to move from the macro context of the material significance of stone that traditionally shapes the identity of these ecclesiastical structures to think about a more micro encounter with these sacred spaces and entrances. And I'm going to look at their decorative surfaces and the thresholds themselves into these ecclesiastical structures. And I should probably admit from the outset of the lecture tonight, for anyone expecting the medieval equivalent of bifold doors, that the doors themselves don't slide, although they are conceptually slippery, hence the title. In order to think about these symbolic entrances and thresholds, I'm going to focus on two main strands of visual engagement that enable these liminal threshold spaces to act as points of tension and transformation for those passing through and across them. Firstly, I'm going to think about the visualization and the construction of the trope of Jerusalem within the early church, as it was primarily expressed through a symbolic bejeweling of significant marginal and threshold spaces in ecclesiastical arts and architecture. Although again, it's probably important to note that this bejeweled Jerusalem was only one way that the heavenly city was imagined during this period. Secondly, I'm going to have a think about the apotropaic figures and material significances of doorways and thresholds themselves, before turning to a case study that involved the particular spoliated iteration of demarcated ecclesiastical space that I hope might bring all of these ideas together in one particular church. Ideas of viewer, viewing and perception in relation to objects and spaces are an integral part of the study of material culture, both in and out of the medieval period. However, in the specific context of ecclesiastical thresholds, a central aspect of visual culture and expression throughout the medieval period is the pervasive, shifting, and symbiotic relationship that was understood to exist between the earthly world and the heavenly kingdom. These two disparate sites of physical and metaphysical experience and imagining are linked by iconographical constants that are reimagined, reinterpreted, and represented across the ecclesiastical landscape and the material artworks and structures that inscribed it, such as the carved and painted thresholds and spoliated spaces I'm going to discuss tonight. Through a concerted employment of the spatial, the temporal, the material, and the immaterial, the forms and motifs of the carved structuring spaces of the early church were deliberately constructed in order to make the heavenly kingdom viscerally present for the earth-bound Christian viewer. And this was done through replicated ecclesiastical architectural forms and individual adaptations of applied sculpture and material adornments onto individual churches. However, before exploring some English examples of significant thresholds, and I've given you three of my favourites on screen, including Wearmouth, Ledsham, and Bradbourne, that you can see, I'm going to set out some of the wider artistic symbolic tropes that might have informed these English iterations. And I'm going to do that by looking at some contextual examples from the wider church, particularly the monumental mosaic programs that we find in Italy. By focusing on these, I'd like to suggest that there are a series of concrete, textual, temporal, and material motifs that allowed for the imagined construction and actualization of heaven for a theologically informed viewer encountering these earthly ecclesiastical forms. Further, I'd argue that such motifs were developed in an anachronic idiom that reflects and refracts a broader imagined constant that exists outside of earthly time, and that this collapsing of time and space for the church happens via a performative actualization of the atemporal locus of the kingdom of heaven through the display of material forms, including precious stones and apotropaic figures, all of which are understood to exist across time and to collapse space for the early church. Adorning architectonic edges and visual margins of sacred images, objects, and spaces with schematic bejeweled forms is a widespread practice for the early church. And I'm showing you a tiny handful of these bejeweled borders that you find across Italian basilicas. They are everywhere. Once you see them, you will notice them time and time again. Now, these bejeweled edges clearly draw on the vision of the heavenly city given in Revelation 21, which states the foundations of the city were adorned with all manner of precious stones. As such, there is arguably no better example through which to start a consideration of the trope of a bejeweled Jerusalem and eschatologically significant thresholds than the early Christian mosaics of Rome and Ravenna, which emulate these Jerusalemic stones of heaven through their iconography and through their materiality. And here I'm just giving you that quote from Revelation that lists all of those stones that we see in the mosaics time and time again. So the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with all manner of precious stones. And then we get that incredibly extensive list. We get jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, sardius, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysopraxis, jacinth, amethyst, and finally pearls. So, turning back to our mosaics, these elaborate, costly and sophisticated decorative schemes consistently employ the imagery of precious stones and the bejeweled Jerusalem to evoke the heavenly city. And they do that alongside depictions of a multivalent space which represents both the historical city of Jerusalem and the eschatological future city of the heavenly kingdom, all of which are displayed alongside their primary ecclesiastical narratives. Together, all of this performs to present a layered and nuanced evocation of Jerusalem, both heavenly and earthly, and it does so by collapsing time and space for its viewer. The peripheral iconography of bejeweled edges is seen throughout these artworks, and these borders form a series of precious frames to the more elaborate narrative iconographies they accompany. As you can see, there's a really rhythmic repetition of chromatic and stylized stones that divide one scene from the next and one area of space within the church from another. These precious borders do not function merely as decoration, although they are decorative, and they're not a passive part of the church iconography. Rather, through their correlation with the shining and bejeweled mural surfaces of the city of Revelation, they serve to make heaven present on earth, realizing and actualizing the space of the heavenly city within that of the church via their symbolic significance, their material identity, their spatial placement, and the architectural emphasis of the church itself. Thus, the relationship between the earthly and the heavenly might be understood to be symbolized through the abbreviated architectural vocabulary of the bejeweled space of the heavenly Jerusalem, whereby conceptualizations of actual and actualized place and past, present, and future are generated for the viewer through the motif of these jewel-encrusted surfaces and structures as they run around the edges and thresholds of significant ecclesiastical spaces, found as they are, delineating apses, domes, arches, entrances, etc., etc. Now, Peter Brown in The Cult of the Saints talks about the potent materiality of these mosaics in creating sacred space within ecclesiastical architecture. And here you can see San Vitale in Ravenna, which is one of the most magical of all mosaic spaces, if you ask me, and many others, I think. So Brown describes mosaics as bringing the light of heaven itself into the space of the church. And this material potency of mosaics, being able to call into being the sacred other, has been recognised by scholars including Dominic James and Annabel Wharton, among many others. Mosaics and the tesserae that make up these artworks are material carriers that are particularly suited to acting as signifiers of the sacreds, performing this role in several ways, not least in their articulation of a glittering mural surface that often seems otherworldly to those viewing these vast expanses of shining, glittering colour, peopled as they are with sacred figures and narratives. However, they also present an artistic reality that is comprised of both presence and absence, substance and the insubstantial. This is understood through their complex minutiae of coloured gilded glass, and the fact that they are tesserae, fractured vitreous forms that are read as complete due to the shifting play of light on surface. Again, this sort of playful materiality might recall the scriptural passages from Revelation, which describes heaven as a shining place, with the city itself pure gold like to clear glass. But also it recalls the myriad scriptural associations of God and light, whereby the jewel-like glittering surface of the mosaics is understood to present the sacred space of heaven and perhaps call into being the presence of the divine for their viewers, whereby the most precious materials of the earth are used to evoke the radiant material form of heaven itself. So this play of material and immaterial and the overlapping presentation of the experiential space of the earthly church, which is evinced in part through the wider scriptural narratives and historicizing scenes displayed in the mosaics, but also the actualized vision of the space of heaven that these things call into being, seems like it might be endemic to the material properties of mosaics. However, it's also seen more specifically, and indeed we might say more literally, in the systematic employment of the motif of jewelled borders, which present a yet more coalesced version of this particular articulation of the sacred in their repeated presentation of formulaic gems, which are understood to symbolise the walls of the city of God, here experienced as an earthly simulacra of those to be found in heaven. The precious stones, set into the envisioned architecture of heaven, provide an iconography through which the heavenly city might be portrayed and experienced by earthly eyes, which is also reflected in the imagining of the earthly church as presenting or foreshadowing heaven. Evidently then, as may be seen through scriptural precedent, exegetical commentary, and here I'm thinking about something like Bede on the Apocalypse, where these gems are mentioned in some detail, and a material ecclesiastical expression, these precious stones and decorative surfaces could be stated to be one of the staple articulations of heaven. The early medieval understanding of highly ornate churches, symbolising the heavenly Jerusalem, is exceptionally widespread. Such multivalent images are complex and nuanced, and the viewing of such images was understood to be an act which both engaged and altered the body, a transformative process that involved an exchange between eyes, mind, and soul, such as the experience offered by the jewelled borders, which can be understood as transformative motifs, effectively turning the space and structure of the church into the space and structure of the heavenly city by means of a metaphysical shift completed by a performative act on the behalf of the viewer. Now, of equal importance to these transformative and transformational bejeweled edges are the eschatological spaces of victory and judgment they adorn, often referred to by the abbreviated form of the triumphal arch, recast from an imperial to an ecclesiastical setting, and the implied entrance into the heavenly city, which is created by these structures. This theological message of triumph is one that's heavily stressed by the wider decorative programmes, which all too often adorn these arches and apses. The implied entrance to Jerusalem, which these monumental forms suggest, is bound up with an eschatology of the church, and the ultimate entrance, or lack thereof perhaps, into heaven, which was understood to occur at the Last Judgment. Thus, these forms are parts of the triumphal architectural articulation of the church, but also work hand in glove with the iconographic device of jewelled borders, with their systematic arrangement of gold-bordered green rectangles, red gems, blue ovals, and interspersed pearls, all of which serve as an aniconic shorthand for the earth, for heaven, for salvation, and for the liminal space of the gates that precede the ultimate entrances to the heavenly city. All of these present a synchronic encounter with the sacred across the sites of the earthly church, while also providing or producing a heavenly vision, which produces an eschatological encounter for those gazing on these surfaces, albeit fleetingly, but it's an encounter that takes place in space, but outside of time. Indeed, if considered in the light of the text of Revelation, the borders which outline the architectural features of these buildings can be considered to literally bejewel the walls of the church, transforming the earthly architecture into its heavenly counterpart, and transforming physical space into metaphysical place, momentarily transforming the space of the walls of the apse into the gate of heaven itself, through a combination of a performative process of looking, of symbolic surface, of exegetical interpretation, and of spaces that are actualized in as much as they are actual. Now, having thus hopefully established that the edges of things were potent and symbolically significant spaces for the early church, I want to think about how this might have carried through to the church in England. The conceptual, material, and visual links between adorned and bejeweled ecclesiastical thresholds and the experiential encounter with sacred space, as understood through the decorative adornments of gemstones, are important here, as they provide a precedent for a spatial construction of the sacreds, which might be found across the disparate sites of the church as it exists in the world. Something else which is noteworthy are the political and stylistic affiliations with Rome, which are so well studied for the early English church. This being so, it's perhaps pertinent to ask if there are similar symbolic entrances in the insular worlds to those seen in the great basilicas of Italy. And from the outset, I'd like to tell you that no, we have no evidence for an analogous use of mosaics in early medieval England. However, both contemporary textual accounts and the material record present strong evidence for an interest in and a preference for dual-toned chromatic adornments in both sacred and secular contexts. And I'm showing you a whole array of personal decorative ornaments here that kind of reinforce that preference for shining, bejeweled surfaces. Alongside this, we have material evidence for a practice of decorating the structures and objects of the church with precious stones and shining metal, and for a sophisticated interplay between surface, object, and subjects, all of which is analogous to those discussed for our Italianate jewelled borders. We also see this textually if we think about works like De Abatibus and the Life of Wilfrid, with all of its references to material production. As well, there are decorative passages found in various media that might evoke similar instances of jewelled ornaments that carry similar eschatological associations to our continental bejewelled borders. These are found on the edges of painted pages and on carved stone sculpture. So here we have two of the illuminated miniatures from the Codex Amiatinus, famously the Ezra page and the Majestus, both of which hopefully you might be able to see have jewelled borders running around their edges. We find a similar motif on carved stone crosses, and here I'm showing you the Easby cross and also the crosshead fragment from Hexham, both of which have little border passages, which are most usually read in terms of being skeuomorphic representations of metalworking techniques here seen in stone, but which I would like to suggest, if they were painted white, might function to present those wonderful heavenly pearls that we see all over our Italian basilicas. Would we then here be looking at, again, thinking about the borders of things being used to conjure eschatological space within these ecclesiastical objects? Such examples remind us that the trope of eschatologically charged bejeweling was available in some material iterations of ecclesiastical objects for the early English church. However, while the possibility remains that jewelled thresholds to ecclesiastical spaces could have been created from now lost paint, there aren't extant examples of carved applied jewelled thresholds. What we do have, however, are some very elaborate doorways. And that's what I want to turn to look at now. So these entrances or threshold spaces produce potent liminal associations of crossing between one place and another, moving between the secular and the sacred. Famous examples of these doorways include the figural sculpture over the entrances of St. Peter's Church at Wearmouth and St. Mary's at Deerhurst, which also present instances of animal head terminals and interlaced zoomorphs on their thresholds. We might also consider the reused spoliated sculpture and dedicatory plaque placed onto the facade of the church at Kirkdale that I'm going to go on to talk about, and things like the elaborate facade of Bradford-on-Avon and the spoliated chancel arch at Escombe as well. All of those might play into this sort of set of objects and spaces that I'm thinking about here. Despite their differing visual articulations, the potency and liminality of these doorways is an idea that permeates ecclesiastical space, both as an experiential actuality and as a conceptual model for thinking about how we create sacred space in church buildings. As a society today, as then, we're surrounded by liminal spaces and events, transformational thresholds that are demarcated by things that surround them. As places, the liminal are mostly recognised only as we step into or out of them, moving across their momentary spaces and places. It's easy to recognise a liminal space. Because of its in-between nature, its edges are always present and demarcated. We know liminal space by its surroundings, its contours, its adjacencies. But while it may be relatively straightforward to recognise these thresholds and in-between pause points of tension, transformation, and exchange, it is perhaps less easy to occupy these spaces, particularly in an ecclesiastical context, where these thresholds serve to demarcate the secular from the sacred. Thresholds as liminal spaces within wider architectural narratives are always significant. As I've said, these are points of tension and exchange. As noted, several significant demarcated thresholds survive from the architecture of the periods, including the enigmatic 7th century zoomorphs that flank the porch at Wearmouth, their beaks forming a saltire cross, and their tails interlaced, culminating in a tau cross, as well as the wonderful 9th century polychromed beast-headed terminals inside the door of the church at Deerhurst. Both of these make present historical time and eschatological space for the early church, and they do this through a series of elusive connections between place, space, memory, and identity, but they rely on the viewer in order to call these into being. We're relatively used to thinking of liminal space as tied to an architectural expression, especially as it is experienced. Take, for example, the ubiquitous example of the liminal threshold, the pause point of a doorway. Here, the liminal is called into being by its relation to other recognised, tactile, emplaced things that frame it, things that demarcate it. Liminal space, then, might really be thought of as a series of liminal moments. In stepping into a liminal space, the conditional assumption is that these are only occupied briefly, momentarily, that they will be left, and that's true. However, in the material and visual sophistry of these thresholds, as well as in their iconographic adornment, there's a clear awareness of the complexity of these moments and spaces for the church, as well as the richness of the significant and symbolic transformations they might offer someone encountering them. In the newly Christianized landscape of medieval England following the Augustinian mission, the stone structures of churches involved the use of a building material that was outside of the vernacular architectural tradition. But as demonstrated by the carvings at Wearmouth, there were various strategies to mediate this strangeness of material, including the emergence of a variety of symbolic forms, many of which had their origins in the art of the pre-conversion period, and so combined familiar elements of ornament and display with the imported tradition of the symbolism of stone. As noted, on the threshold to the entrance into the church at Wearmouth are two interlaced zoomorphs, with their tails arranged and interlaced to form a tau cross, carved onto the inner surfaces of the imposts flanking the entrance into the church. And you might be able to see them a bit more clearly in the later floor mosaic, how that kind of works and plays out on the stone of the porch. Now, when considering this image in the context of the employment of apotropaic images at sites of vulnerability that might come from a wider socio-cultural context, it could be argued that there are strong associations which accompany the use of such symbolic motifs. And we might find these on objects including the Sutton Hoo and Coppergate helmets. Sutton Hoo famously buried around 625, Coppergate dating to around the 8th century. Now, these motifs of apotropaic beasts placed at pivotal points on objects seem to have been transferred into a Christian context at Wearmouth, retaining their protective function, but giving them a somewhat different identity to their previous incarnations. The form of the entwined serpents or zoomorphs found at Wearmouth may well be related to this militant apotropaic precedent, but the organisation of the pattern and the meaning attached to the symbolic form has changed. Instead of expressing the totemic, militaristic, animalistic power of a warrior elite, these serpentine forms remain powerful and protective, but here indicate something about the nature of the church they now adorn. The incorporation of these motifs into the physical spaces of the church reflects the liminal and fluid state of the transition period of the 7th century, but also underscores the significance of the entry into the church and to the possible salvation and eschatological understanding that entails. The placement of the zoomorphs at Wearmouth is striking. When approaching the church, it is not these which are first seen. Rather, the observable ornament on the structure is figural, namely the life-sized, now incredibly weathered structure that exists on the tower. And I hope you can see my cursor as it moves here. Maybe you can. But this figure, which is now unrecognisable, has been tentatively identified as either possibly being a Christ in Majesty or the figure of St. Peter himself, placed in the gable of the doorway to the church. It's only in the act of crossing the threshold into the building, in the act of traversing the liminal transitional point between one space into another, at the moment of being caught between the secular and the sacred, the earthly and the heavenly, that the cross-tailed zoomorphs, redolents of other cultural beliefs, structures and symbols, become visible. In their new ecclesiastical setting, these zoomorphs are familiar in form, but new in detail and association. Or to put it another way, at the point of most vulnerability for anyone entering or encountering this built space, at the point of change between one space and another, the symbolic vocabulary chosen for display also changes from the figural ornament of the classical tradition associated with the institution of the church and with Rome into non-figural zoomorphic ornament, traditionally associated with apotropaic significances. And at this transitional point, the liminal decoration of the threshold takes on the added symbolic potency of the cross, formed by the interlaced heads and tails of the serpents, recognized between the zoomorphic beasts, surrounding the body as it crosses the threshold into the space of the church. Arguably, placing a cross supported and formed by two serpents not only recalls the theological motif of Christ recognized between the beasts, which was a prevalent motif in the insular world, and you might recall is famously placed on the Ruthill and Bewcastle crosses, but is also known from the Canticle of Habakkuk and Bede's work on that text. And this motif brings the performative apotropaic traditions of ornament seen in pre-Christian contexts to bear on the powerfully developed symbolism of the cross within the church. The act of viewing such images, or indeed of walking between them, involves confronting a visual paradox of sorts. You need to decode a cryptic image, which was created to be clear, yet unclear, hidden yet obvious, and contains coded images hiding in plain sight. In such a tradition of looking, viewing becomes a performative act. And in the moments of recognition of the cross, of the zoomorphs, of the threshold, the viewer themselves becomes transformed. Perhaps of equal importance to their iconographic significance is the placement of these apotropaic forms. They're displayed at a point that reinforces structural tension and conceptual transformation that is offered by these ecclesiastical sites, both materially and symbolically. They act as a visual reinforcement that serves to emphasize both the protective nature of the structuring object, that is to say, the ecclesiastical threshold, but also the apotropaic function of the symbolic forms, and indeed the wider structure of the church itself. Taken together, these considerations suggest the point of the threshold was being consciously selected and demarcated as a particular place, articulating the space and subsequently the moment of crossing between one place and another, from the area or state outside the church to that within, walking between the apotropaic forms of cross and beasts under the protective ecclesiastical figure and through the stone structure to enter the space, and so also the salvation offered by the church. Alongside such significant thresholds and material expressions of identity and authority, as demonstrated in the ecclesiastical architecture of early medieval England, is a widespread use of spolia and skeuomorphic stone, which seem to go hand in hand with these apotropaic utterances that we find on church thresholds. Now, these examples of spolia range from the reused Roman fabric featured so prominently across the stone churches of early medieval England to the evocative skeuomorphic forms found in many of these architectural spaces, including the baluster shafts of the church at Weymouth, which you can just see above the zoomorphs here. A significant number of these baluster shafts were found across the sites of Jarrow and Mount Weymouth, and Rosemary Cramp has suggested that they may have formed part of the liturgical furniture at Jarrow, perhaps delineating a schola cantorum like that found at Santa Maria in Cosmedon in Rome. And if so, these stone balusters would really reinforce the Romanness of these church structures in terms of the identity that they present. These balusters are skeuomorphs, shapeshifters, and that they coherently preserve a visual trace of a technology that is endemic to working in wood, not required by their current technological form of being carved in stone. However, in the preservation of those horizontal bands that run around the balusters, which would have been created by lathe turning in a wooden original, there seems to be a really conscious decision to preserve and present this vestigial form of a traditional technology, and a very conscious visual quoting or referencing of the other, in this case, a wooden original recast in stone. In this remembering of wood through stone, there may also be a preservation of some of the symbolic identities of that other earlier wooden identity, maybe preserving some sort of continuity of meaning through a continuity of form, despite the rupture of tradition created by employing another material entirely, here stone, with all the significance and romanitas that that material carries. Skeuomorphs are powerful devices that retain a rich symbolism, while also evoking an emotional or at least cognitive response through their relationship with their previous incarnation of the other object, technology, or material. And this retention might also replicate and prompt associated memories and significances for people viewing objects that carry these traces with them. In the case of the skeuomorphs found in the early English church, where much of the evident skeuomorphism comes with a material shift in quite a limited number of similar forms and tropes, such as wood to metal, metal to stone, or wood to stone, these forms may also have resounding symbolic significances in terms of both the original referent and the new material identity. The specific form of a skeuomorph presents and references more than one set of material significances, and it does so in a multivalent manner in order to produce a new symbolic whole. Very much in an analogous manner to that in which the church absorbs and replicates material and cultural identities and iconographies in a conversion context, such as perhaps the Wearmouth zoomorphs. There is arguably a conscious eschatological construction of demarcated sacred spaces through the use of carved and built stone in the periods that sits happily and fluidly alongside well-established associations with Rome. With this in mind, as a final example this evening, I'd like to turn to a little studied despoliated skeuomorph housed in St Gregory's Minster at Kirkdale. The church here consists, quote, of a small 19th century west tower, a nave whose main walls date from the middle of the 11th century, with a north aisle added in the 13th, and an aisleless chancel with north chapel rebuilt in 1881. The date of the building is firmly fixed with unusual precision between 1055 and 1065 by the inscription over the sundial built into the wall over the south door. This description of Kirkdale, given by Taylor and Taylor in their magnum opus of early English churches, follows that provided by C.L.R. Tudor in 1876, who in his introduction to the church considered that, quote, its very stones speak to us in silent but eloquent language. And this quote from Tudor is one that I think could be usefully expanded out to think about many of these early ecclesiastical structures more generally. The inscription over the entrance to the church at Kirkdale informs the visitor that Orm, son of Gamel, bought St Gregory's church when it was broken and fallen, and had it made anew from the ground in honour of Christ and St Gregory in the days of Edward the King and Tostig the Earl. This establishes the existence of an earlier church, which at the time of the Scandinavian rebuilding of the present structure, which is firmly dated to the mid-11th century, around 1054, was broken and fallen, a fact borne out by the reuse of a significant quantity of carved stone within the fabric of the 11th century rebuilding. Among these was the so-called Kirkdale skeuomorph, which is here. which has since been returned to the interior of the church from its position in the west exterior wall at the base of the structure, where it was noted by Haig and documented by Tudor. And here I'd like to thank Lorna Watts for her discussion of the skeuomorph and the significance of its various placements at Kirkdale as the building has evolved. Now, in two pieces, the stone is elaborately carved in such a way as to suggest an ornately embroidered piece of fabric of the type used to adorn prominent tombs, graves, and shrines in the period, as noted by Richard Bailey. The significance of rich and embroidered textiles within the church is well documented by early medieval writers, including Bede, Edius Stephanus, and Ethelwulf, and is also borne out in evidence provided by fragments of the textiles found in the Cuthbert coffin, as well as the practice of adorning prominent tombs with spolia, as described by Gregory of Tours in a much earlier context. All of this going to establish the authority of a tradition of a use of luxury textiles seen in later medieval England. Indeed, so great is the significance of this perceived practice of adorning tombs with textiles that it has been suggested by Bailey that at Kirkdale, a major pre-Viking site, the duty of the faithful covering the grave is effectively, quote, permanently performed in stone on this monument. I've suggested elsewhere that the carving on this skeuomorph might be a type of visual exegesis that incorporates ideas of the symbolic importance of Old Testament structures, including perhaps the tabernacle and the temple as described by Bede. Thinking perhaps of the curtain or threshold of the Holy of Holies, evoked here through the iconographic features of the monument's surface and the conceptual identity of fabric recast in the permanence of stone. This would be quite interesting to think about if this had originally been a polychromed monument, which may well have further underscored some of those Old Testament references. Now, alongside this possible reference, there's also a presentation of a series of interlaced geometric crosses that happen on the surface of the stone, which is interesting in and of its own right, in all sorts of ways. This being so, and the Kirkdale skeuomorph is undoubtedly significant as an apotropaic monument in its original funerary context, it's arguable that the skeuomorph was specifically intended to highlight a threshold between this world and the next when it was set into the walls of the church as spolia, perhaps in an analogous manner to that of the jewelled borders of the continental churches, which also performed to collapse the space between heaven and earth. Building on this, the other later spolia set into the walls of the minster at Kirkdale should be considered when exploring the iconographic understanding of eschatological reuse and construction. The spoliated fragments demonstrate three phases of sculptural and architectural development at Kirkdale. There's an early phase, which is represented by the sundial and the two funerary monuments that you can see on the very left of your screen. And then there is a revitalisation of sculptural tradition that share an aesthetic common to Yorkshire and Rydale, as well as the phase of rebuilding noted on the dedicatory inscription, in which the pre-existing sculpture on the site was placed as ornament into the walls of the church, incorporating the sundial, the funerary monuments, some crosses, and a fragment of knotwork into the surface of its walls. As recognised by several scholars, and you'll have to forgive my sort of paint by numbers diagram here, but just to try and give you an idea of where these things are found on the walls of the church, although bearing in mind the two funerary slabs are now back inside the building, no longer in the tower. As recognised by several scholars, the sundial set in the porch over the entrance to the door preserves the legacy of the past, as well as announcing a historically aware construction of the present, the rebuilding of the past church by Orm with deliberacy and with intent. Through reusing a Roman stone, a visual statement is made that echoes the Romanitas common to the periods. The grave covers reused in the fabric of the west end of the church function to demarcate a symbolic threshold into sacred space, which may or may not incorporate Old Testament references and eschatological resonances. While the spoliated crosses set low down in the foundations of the church might be understood to symbolize the church literally being rebuilt upon the symbolic form of the cross, with all of the salvific implications that would entail. This placement is all the more striking given its positioning in the west wall of the church, near the original entrance. Where the skeuomorphic grave slab at Kirkdale is given spatial prominence next to that dedicatory inscription stone. Through this sort of employment, this very carefully constructed employment of spoliated and skeuomorphic stone at Kirkdale, there seems to be a consistent exegetical message being produced that it is through the stones of this church and through the salvation of the cross that the church also will be saved. Which is quite an interesting message if we're thinking about rebuilding, replication, and reconstruction. The west-east orientation of the spolia, entrance, and church as a whole at Kirkdale would potentially emphasise this eschatological scheme in stone, as would the seemingly deliberate use of spolia, which emphasises the form of the cross. Heidi Stoner has taken this reading further, suggesting that the knotwork of ambiguous date placed in the East End might also have a role to play in the exegetical and political significance evident in the Kirkdale spolia. Incorporating her observations into this discussion and reading from west to east, we could argue that the tower, which held the earliest sculpture on site, displays the history of the church and imitates an eschatological threshold through the reuse of these funerary monuments. The crosses and the sundial displayed on the south-facing wall tell not just of how Orm rebuilt the church, but also inform viewers of how and why this act was completed, all leading to a piece of centrally placed knotted stonework, which has a uniquely contemporary identity with the rebuilt church at Kirkdale. This knotted motif is placed in a location that represents the eschatological future, set as it is into the east end of the church, perhaps allowing those who viewed these stones to contemplate not only the past, present, and future of the church, but also the microcosm of their church, their lives, and their modes of stoneworking, alongside Orm's particular role in this church's history on a lived and local level, all set within a wider eschatological narrative. It's thus possible to argue that these distinctly worked, deliberately placed and consciously reused stones recall, establish, and actualize the symbolic vocabulary of other places such as Rome or the heavenly Jerusalem within early medieval England, while providing multivalent and experiential encounters with sacred spaces for those engaging with them. Further, going beyond such political, geographical, and institutional concerns, such an engagement in stone and with surface asks viewers to recognise the interlinked and multivalent importance of time, space, and identity, as it's recognised through the shape and structure of the church, reminding those viewing these reused stones and engaging with these significant thresholds that earthly time was not a constant, but instead was set against the eternal achronic present of potential future salvation. An eschatological awareness built into the very fabric of early medieval material culture, underscoring and emphasizing symbolic significances of these ecclesiastical entrances, as well as the wider ecclesiastical spaces, stories, and beliefs they serve to present and to herald. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting and really, really good stuff. So if anybody has any questions, do drop them in the chat box and we'll get round to them. We have one already in the chat box, but I've got a question and I want to get it out of my head first before I can entirely forget about it. Sticking it in the Rydale area, there's always been one object from, I think it was St Mary's at Lastingham, which has always stuck with me. And it's, and if we're thinking about the different forms in these thresholds that you've shared with us, there was one fragment, and I think it was a chair fragment. So if we're going to look at, I was wondering there if there's any sort of relationship between, it's sort of like an animal head as a sort of terminal on one of these sides to possibly a chair. And I was just wondering, in terms of like liturgical furniture, if we can read anything else sort of similarly about what you've shared with us in terms of thresholds in the ecclesiastical setting.
Such an interesting question. Thank you. I don't know where to start with that. But it's actually, I'll confess from the get-go that it's been years since I've been to Lastingham, and I tend to get distracted by that gigantic cross fragment whenever I am there, actually. So I would have to go back and look carefully at your beast-headed throne piece. But it would remind me of some of the Jarrow fragments, which have the wonderful kind of lion throne. And I'd point you towards Heidi Stoner's PhD thesis, which was on kingship in Anglo-Saxon England and the sort of material expression of kingship and the accoutrement of how we can identify kings and things. And she has a whole section on thrones and animal parts. So if you want that reference, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be great. We've got one other question here, and elements of it I think you've certainly sort of touched upon this evening. It's do you see a relationship between a carved threshold and thresholds created by elaborately decorated textiles used to cloth and cover altars?
I think that's actually quite a complicated question, because it depends on where the fabric is employed. But yes, I do, in that fabrics in and of themselves create layers around and between things. So I think if we're thinking about liminal spaces, if we're thinking about spaces that are somehow permeable or can be crossed, yes, I think there are threads that we can pull around textiles and textile coverings, but it's not the same experiential encounter with a space that you would get if you can cross a physical carved threshold, or if you can't cross a threshold, thinking about who has access to space churches, who would get to go into apses, would you get to walk around the sort of choir area? So access and entrances is a whole other ball game, isn't it? Who would get to go where? But I think, yeah, there are conceptual parallels between fabric, sort of veils and thresholds and covers and carved entrances, but I wouldn't argue that they were the same. I would say there are conceptual similarities, but it would depend on the particular examples.
Fantastic. There's unless anybody has any last minute questions, you want to throw them in the chat. There is someone who's left a comment saying that they would like a reference to the kingship paper. So perhaps if I get this recording up on YouTube, I can include that in the
so it's
box.
Just to reiterate, that's Heidi Stoner's PhD thesis, but some of that is in print, so it is findable. But yeah, if anybody wants it, please just drop me an email and I'll send you the full reference.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you again, Meg. Thank you so much for that. And I'm just going to, for the interest of everybody watching, unless you aren't aware, I think Hugh may have said last time, but we've got a couple of upcoming lectures in the series, and September's is on September the 7th. And we are delighted to have Dr. Alex Woodcock, who's going to be speaking about Romanesque sculpture in Devon and Cornwall. So yeah, a little bit later than what we've heard about tonight, but we're moving it through the Middle Ages, and then we will have some more great lectures. Fantastic. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for watching. Thank you again, Meg.